The winter of 1941 arrived early across the eastern plains, bringing with it a cold that settled into the wooden walls of transit camps and provisional shelters erected along the rail lines leading deeper into the Soviet interior. Snow fell in uneven drifts across the open fields where temporary structures had been raised to house those who had been moved from the Western territories as the front advanced. The evacuation had begun in haste during the autumn months, when the roads were still passable and the railways functioned under strain but with some measure of regularity. By December the cold had become a constant presence, seeping through gaps in hastily constructed barracks and freezing the water in metal basins left outside overnight. The war had not yet reached these areas directly, but its effects were visible in the overcrowding of train stations, the thin rations distributed at collection points, and the faces of those who had traveled east with whatever belongings they could carry. Alina Koval was 15 years old when she arrived at a resettlement facility located on the outskirts of a mid-sized industrial town in the Urals. She had traveled by rail with her mother and a younger brother, leaving behind a village that had been evacuated in stages as the fighting moved closer. Her father had been conscripted in the early weeks of the war and had not returned. Word had come through unofficial channels that his unit had been caught in an encirclement near the border, and no further information followed. Her mother, weakened by months of disrupted nutrition and the strain of displacement, had developed a persistent cough that worsened in the cold. She spent most of her time in the shared sleeping quarters, lying on a narrow cot beneath a single wool blanket that had been issued upon arrival. Alina's younger brother, who was 11, had been placed in a youth labor brigade assigned to clearing snow from rail sidings and assisting with the unloading of supply trains. Alina herself was assigned to work in a factory that produced metal components for military use, a facility that had been expanded rapidly to accommodate the increased demand brought on by the war. The factory occupied a series of low brick buildings connected by covered walkways that offered minimal protection from the wind. The main production hall was a long, poorly lit space with a high ceiling supported by iron beams. Rows of metal presses, lathes, and assembly benches filled the interior, each station operated by workers who stood or sat on wooden stools for shifts that extended into the evening hours. The air inside was thick with the smell of machine oil, metal filings, and coal smoke from the furnaces that provided heat to only certain sections of the building. Alina was placed at a bench near the center of the hall, where she was trained to operate a hand press used to stamp out small metal brackets that would later be assembled into larger components. The work required repetitive motion. Positioning a strip of metal beneath the press, pulling down the lever with both hands, removing the finished piece, and placing it into a wooden crate at her side. The metal was cold to the touch, and her hands grew numb within the first hour of each shift despite the thin cotton gloves she had been given. The factory operated on a schedule that began before dawn and continued until well after dark. Alina woke each morning in the barracks where she slept alongside her mother and dozens of other women and children who had been evacuated from various regions. The building was unheated except for a single iron stove at one end, which burned irregularly depending on the availability of coal. She dressed in layers of worn clothing, wrapping a scarf around her head and pulling on boots that had been repaired multiple times with scraps of leather and cloth. Breakfast consisted of a portion of black bread and a cup of weak tea served in a communal dining area adjacent to the sleeping quarters. The bread was dense and often stale, but it was rationed carefully, and Alina ate slowly, trying to make the portion last. Afterwards she walked with a group of other workers along a dirt road that had been cleared of snow by earlier shifts, passing through a checkpoint where factory identification papers were inspected before entry. The rhythm of the work was steady and unvarying. Each metal strip had to be aligned precisely beneath the press to avoid waste, and the finished brackets were inspected periodically by a floor supervisor who moved between stations with a clipboard, noting production totals and checking for defects. Alina learned to maintain a consistent pace that allowed her to meet the expected output without exhausting herself too quickly. The noise in the hall was constant, a combination of mechanical clanking, the hiss of steam from the heating pipes, and the muted conversations of workers during brief pauses. There were no formal breaks, but workers were permitted to step away from their stations for a few minutes to warm their hands near one of the coal-fed stoves positioned at intervals along the walls. Alina used these moments to flex her fingers and shake out the stiffness that accumulated in her wrists and forearms. Midday brought a short meal period during which workers gathered in a side room where soup was ladled from large pots into tin bowls. The soup was thin, often containing a few pieces of potato or cabbage and occasionally a small amount of barley. Alina ate standing near a window that overlooked a loading yard where freight wagons were parked in rows, their contents covered by tarps weighted down with stones. Beyond the yard the landscape stretched flat and white, broken only by the bare outlines of distant trees and the occasional plume of smoke from other industrial buildings scattered across the area. She thought about her mother, who had been too weak to leave the barracks for several days, and about her brother, whose hands had developed painful cracks from the cold and the rough handling of metal crates. She did not speak much to the other workers, most of whom were older women or girls near her own age, all focused on the small routines that made the days manageable. The winter deepened and the cold became more severe. Snow piled against the outer walls of the factory and had to be cleared regularly to prevent drifts from blocking the entrances. The heating system, which relied on a combination of coal furnaces and steam pipes fed from a central boiler, functioned inconsistently. Some sections of the production hall remained warm enough to work without heavy outer clothing, while others were only marginally warmer than the outdoor temperature. Alina's hands began to show signs of frostbite, the skin on her fingertips turning pale and losing sensation. She wrapped strips of cloth around her palms beneath the gloves, but the fabric became stiff and uncomfortable after prolonged use. The supervisor noticed the condition of her hands during an inspection and provided a tin of petroleum jelly, instructing her to apply it at the end of each shift. The jelly helped somewhat, though it left a greasy residue that attracted metal dust and made the first hour of work the next day more difficult. Production quotas were increased in late January as word came through official channels that the front had stabilized in some areas and that the demand for military supplies remained high. The factory extended the length of shifts by an additional hour, and workers were told that failure to meet output targets could result in reassignment to less favorable positions. Alina adjusted her pace slightly, working with greater focus and taking fewer pauses. The physical toll became more pronounced. Her shoulders ached from the repetitive motion of pulling down the press lever, and a dull pain developed in her lower back from standing for extended periods. She noticed similar signs of fatigue in the other workers, though few spoke openly about it. Complaints were discouraged, and the general understanding was that everyone was expected to contribute to the war effort without objection. The accident occurred on a morning in early February, during a period when the factory had been operating at near maximum capacity for several consecutive weeks. Alina had arrived at her station as usual, and was midway through her second hour of work when she heard a sharp metallic snap followed by a loud hissing sound from somewhere deeper in the production hall. The noise was distinct enough to cut through the ambient clatter of machinery, and several workers paused to look in the direction of the sound. Within seconds a cloud of steam began to spread from one of the large boilers positioned near the far wall, obscuring the area in a dense white fog. The supervisor shouted for workers to move away from the affected section, and a general confusion spread as people stepped back from their stations, uncertain whether to continue working or evacuate the hall entirely. The steam continued to pour out, and the temperature in the immediate vicinity rose sharply, creating a humid, oppressive atmosphere that contrasted starkly with the cold air in the rest of the building. It became clear that one of the primary steam pipes feeding the heating system had ruptured, likely due to a combination of metal fatigue and the extreme cold that had stressed the infrastructure over the preceding weeks. The rupture had occurred at a joint where two sections of pipe connected, and the escaping steam carried with it a scalding heat that made it dangerous to approach the area. Workers were ordered to move to the opposite end of the hall, while a repair crew was summoned. Alina stood with the others near the main entrance, watching as the steam gradually dissipated and the full extent of the damage became visible. The ruptured pipe had sprayed boiling water across a section of the floor, leaving puddles that steamed in the cold air. Several workstations in the immediate area had been abandoned hastily, and tools and unfinished metal pieces lay scattered where they had been dropped. The repair crew arrived within the hour, bringing with them welding equipment and replacement pipe sections. They worked quickly, sealing off the damaged section and redirecting steam flow through auxiliary lines. The process took most of the morning, during which production in the affected area remained halted. Alina and the other workers were instructed to return to their stations in sections of the hall that were still operational, though the overall output for the day would fall short of the expected quota. The supervisor moved through the hall, reassuring workers that the situation was under control and that normal operations would resume by the following day. Alina returned to her press and resumed work, though her focus was disrupted by the residual tension from the incident and the lingering smell of scorched metal and steam that hung in the air. The rupture had broader consequences that became apparent over the following days. The damaged pipe had been part of a critical heating circuit, and its failure reduced the overall efficiency of the system. Certain sections of the factory, including the area where Alina worked, received less heat than before, making the already cold environment even more difficult to endure. Workers began wearing additional layers, and productivity slowed as hands grew stiff and fingers lost dexterity in the colder conditions. The factory administration issued a directive emphasizing the importance of maintaining output despite the temporary difficulties, but the physical reality of working in near-freezing temperatures made compliance difficult. Alina found herself moving more slowly, pausing more frequently to warm her hands, and struggling to maintain the focus required for precision work. The winter dragged on with little change. Supplies became more erratic as transport routes were disrupted by snowstorms and fuel shortages. Rations were reduced slightly, and the bread distributed at meals became even denser and less palatable. Alina's mother remained bedridden for most of this period, her cough worsening to the point where she could barely speak without triggering prolonged fits. Medical attention was limited, and the camp's small clinic was overwhelmed with cases of frostbite, respiratory illness, and malnutrition. Alina visited her mother in the evenings after finishing her shift, bringing whatever small portion of food she could save from her own ration. Her brother continued his work with the labor brigade, though he too showed signs of physical decline, his face thinner and his movements slower than they had been at the start of winter. By March the cold began to ease slightly, though the thaw brought with it mud and flooding in low-lying areas around the factory compound. The roads became nearly impassable, and workers trudged through ankle-deep muck to reach their stations. The factory itself suffered from leaks in the roof where snow had accumulated and melted, dripping water onto equipment, and creating hazardous conditions on the floors. Alina's workstation remained functional, but she had to contend with puddles that formed around her bench and occasional drips from overhead beams that soaked her clothing. The administration organized work crews to patch the roof, but the repairs were makeshift and only partially effective. Spring arrived gradually, bringing longer daylight hours and a slow improvement in conditions. The heating system was repaired more thoroughly, and the factory resumed something closer to normal operations. Rations improved slightly as supply lines stabilized, and the general atmosphere in the camp became less oppressive. Alina's mother showed modest signs of recovery, regaining enough strength to sit up and eat without assistance, though her health remained fragile. The war continued in the background, its progress discussed in whispers and through official announcements posted on bulletin boards, but the immediate concerns of daily survival occupied most people's attention. Alina continued to work at the factory throughout the spring and into the summer, her hands gradually toughening and her body adapting to the demands of repetitive labor. She learned to anticipate the rhythms of the machinery, to judge the quality of metal by its feel, and to work efficiently even under difficult conditions. The experience left marks that went beyond the physical, shaping a resilience that would remain with her long after the war ended. She did not speak of these months in dramatic terms, nor did she consider herself exceptional. She was simply one among thousands who had been displaced, who had worked, and who had endured. When the war finally ended in 1945, Alina was 19 years old and still employed at the factory, which by then had transitioned partially to producing civilian goods. She remained in the Urals for another year before returning west with her mother and brother to what remained of their original region. Their village had been destroyed, and they resettled in a nearby town where reconstruction efforts were underway. Alina found work in a textile mill, a job that required similar manual dexterity, but was less physically demanding than the metal press work she had done during the war. She married in her early 20s, to a man who had served in the army and returned with injuries that limited his ability to perform heavy labor. They had 3 children, raised in a small apartment in a housing block built during the post-war reconstruction period. Alina rarely spoke about the years she had spent in the factory, not because the memories were too painful, but because they seemed ordinary in the context of what so many others had experienced. She had not been at the front, had not witnessed combat, and had not suffered the most extreme deprivations. Yet the cold, the hunger, the monotony, and the constant low-level fear of illness or injury had left an imprint that shaped her approach to life. She valued stability, avoided waste, and taught her children to appreciate the small comforts that seemed unremarkable to those who had not known their absence. She kept a small photograph from the war years, a group portrait taken outside the factory, in which she appeared as a thin girl in an oversized coat, standing among rows of similarly dressed figures. She looked at it occasionally, not with nostalgia, but with a quiet recognition of the distance between that time and the life she had built afterward. In her later years, after her children had grown and her husband had passed, Alina moved to a smaller apartment in a quieter part of town. She worked part-time at a community center, assisting with administrative tasks and organizing activities for local residents. She spoke little about the war even then, though she sometimes attended gatherings where veterans and those who had contributed to the home front shared their experiences. She listened more than she spoke, nodding at familiar details and occasionally adding a brief comment about the cold, the work, or the way people had managed under difficult circumstances. When she died in 1993, her children found among her belongings the old photograph, along with a small tin box containing a few personal items from the evacuation period. A worn scarf, a metal identification tag, and a piece of cloth that had once been part of a factory-issue glove. These objects, unremarkable in themselves, carried the weight of a history that had been lived quietly and without ceremony.